All right, welcome to the October 15th Istio Working Group meeting. We are on branch cut today, so if you have any pull requests that are on feature merges in particular that are on the verge of merging, please coordinate with the release team to see that those merge before the branch gets cut. If you have any questions, you can reach out to Gustavo or the others on the release team. Did anyone, I don't know if we have anyone here from the release team. Were there any announcements or updates on the branch cut? I'm going to go ahead and take that as a no and hand things over to Ian for the first item on the agenda.
Sure. Thanks, Mitch. So this is a proposal to update the workload API service with creation time that I'd like to discuss. The issue that we're looking to resolve with this is when we are resolving a host name in our DNS proxy, we run through and check for some very specific things, like does that host name's definition come from my own namespace? And ultimately, failing all of those, we eventually just grab the first one. And in this context, first just means like the top of the vector, which is derived from a hash map when we're doing all this. And so that's dependent on the ordering that it was added and internal implementation details, etc. It's not necessarily like stable or a good thing. To my mind, the better solution would be to return the oldest. And in order to do that, I'd like to get the creation time in there. If we like the approach, my hope would be to just add creation time to the API with no implementation change for like 128. And that way we'll have some backwards compatibility in the protobuf when we actually implement this for like maybe 129. And then there have been some alternative ideas proposed that we could figure out a better way to limit scope. I'm not sure that that's 100% a solution to this. I think it's a complementary one, though, that would really reduce the blast radius. So yeah, if folks have thoughts, Stephen.
Yeah, could you just give an example of when, like, a situation where it would return a different address or resolve differently, depending on just how the hash map ends up being?
So like ultimately, if the host name is not defined in your namespace and it's defined in like, I don't know, 2 or 3 other namespaces, maybe folks are doing testing with it or whatever, and it resolves to their mock.
Yeah.
That ordering is like underspecified at this point.
Okay, so it's like if other namespaces have the same multiple service entries with the same host name.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
And then one other thing to note, Stephen has a PR right now, which handles how this works internal to a namespace alone. And that helps a lot, but it is not exactly resolving the same thing. So just to clarify that.
Ian, do we in Envoy, how does this work? Because I know that what we say is that it's unspecified behavior, but I don't know if it's unspecified if it happens to be implemented based on timestamp ordering, so it's deterministic, or if it's truly randomized like it is in ztunnel.
That's a good question. I haven't looked at exactly how it's implemented internal to Envoy.
Okay, one thing I'll say, I just realized that is fundamentally different though, is that in Envoy, the semantics are a bit more nuanced than what we have in zTunnel. So we do have the, it's in my namespace, it's an Istio system namespace, but we also have the sidecar scope. And so if I include namespace foo, namespace bar, namespace baz, and then not some other namespaces, we search the ones in the sidecar scope. And I think we maybe even do it in order. So even if we don't fall back to timestamp, it's like you can control it still if you're willing to set up the config. But that's different in zTunnel because we obviously don't have such a scoping mechanism. I do think that more fundamentally, the lack of a scoping is like the root cause of this issue, and deterministically picking in what is essentially a random one is kind of a crutch working around that. Like if we had the ability to, for a namespace to select which ones it wants to use, right, then we wouldn't really need this. Now, that being said, all the scoping stuff we've talked about so far for ambient has been about exporting, not importing, which is also different, because then you can't necessarily solve it since, two namespaces may both want to export google.com. Why not? Whereas with a sidecar, it's import, and then it's kind of your responsibility to pick which one you want. I don't, like importing has never come up with ambient before. So I don't know, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. Oh, sorry to cut you
No,
off.
go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was going to say, I absolutely see how better scoping would potentially eliminate or at least reduce this. I think you could still wind up in a weird case. Although if the client is allowed to scope namespaces, we could take them in the order that they specified, like you mentioned before. For sidecar scope, and that would, I think, be a full resolution that doesn't matter about creation time. Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, so I was going to weigh in, assuming we don't do export to and scoping, because assuming we don't do that, I think if I understood correctly, right now is the host name with the services we're trying to resolve is a little bit undeterministic than we'd like to. What we really like to, which I think Ian is what you are proposing, is why don't we just return the service match that host name with the oldest in the system that according to our creation timestamp. So that at least what has been working will continue to work, and this new problematic service entry which have a conflict with the existing host, it won't be effective, and we could potentially return. I think we already do status on service entry, so we could potentially guide the user, hey, there's a problem with your service entry, can you go ahead fix it because of the conflict? Would that be a reasonable user experience, we think, without the scoping support?
So let me break it out into two things. All of the work to stabilize this would unfortunately have to be done in the data plane at the time of the lookup. And so it's sort of separate from status because the data plane won't write status. That is a correct assessment, but with one caveat, which is just sort of a flaw in how service entry API works. If I already have a really old service entry and I add a host to it, that host will inherit the creation time of the service entry, and all of a sudden you'll get this lurch to that. I don't have a solution for that necessarily. I guess we could write status of when the host was added into the service entry or something, but maybe that's orthogonal or at least out of scope. But anyway, that flaw
Would it be fair to take the most recent updated time? I'm just thinking loud here. You still want the older updated time because at service entry, you could potentially update your service entry even with that same host. Or do we have to do it per host? I'm trying to think, do we have to go down to that detail?
Yeah, I mean, you end up with another weird situation then where like the service entry you were relying on gets an annotation or some label or something added, and then its update is more recent, and so you lurch. I don't know that that's a problem or specifically worse. But anyways, I think it's just a complexity inherent to the service entry API, being able to specify multiple host names.
Yeah. So there's no status to the problematic service entry. If I'm deploying a service entry that already have a conflict and there's no current way to propagate that status to the user, how would the user be able to find that out?
Don't we have an analyzer for that already? Conflicting service entries?
So there's, I guess, two. I don't know the answer to the analyzer thing. I guess the question there would be like, if your intent is to hijack that domain for the entire mesh, and there is something in conflict, then yeah, we could do that. Probably for the most part, people want it for their clients, and they would still be able to do that because we will first check if the host name is defined in their namespace, and then the fallback behavior would be to take the oldest. Does that make sense?
So we do allow people to hijack. So let's say if I'm a user, I already defined this service name with host name full, and maybe for my namespace, and then you own your own namespace. You also want to define the host name full. Should we even allow that? Because it's a conflict on the exact full qualified host name.
So our lookups are by namespace host name right now. So there's, in some sense, no conflict there if two people define it for their own use. Where it gets weird is when you're in a like third namespace that doesn't define it, and you have non-deterministic behavior about, well, which one of those is the one that my client is going to use.
I see. So you always prefer the local host name when looking up the service host name. So if you have one that's already, there's a service entry defined within the namespace, you prefer to use that.
Yeah, so the exact logic that we do right now is we check if it's a host name from your own namespace, the same as the client. We use that if that's true. Then we'll check a preferred namespace, which you can define, which would be like maybe Istio system or whatever. And if there's one in Istio system that matches, we'll use that. And then lastly, we fall to this non-deterministic behavior of just grabbing the first one out of our data structure.
I see. Thank you. That's actually more complex than I had thought.
But do we agree that having conflicting namespaces is like invalid configuration or just undefined behavior?
What do you mean by conflicting namespaces?
Sorry, conflicting host names.
I don't necessarily think that it's invalid config. I think it becomes invalid and or weird because there's no scoping. And so someone who wants to say like, oh, I'm going to send google.com to my mock for testing purposes can impact someone in a different namespace. And right now, their defense against that would be to like, domain squat google.com with their own service entry. Is that track, Stephen? And then John can go?
Yeah, that makes sense. I said it's in the chat, but I do wonder if like, no, it's not a complete thought. John can go.
Yeah, I was just going to provide some context on this. So long ago, like 6 years ago, Istio had internally a model where there was one definition of a host name globally. And we ran into problems because what people were doing, or what they wanted to at least, was like have each team define all the domains they want to reach in their namespace and then export them only locally. So it's kind of like what Keith mentioned in the chat of like a namespace service entry. They didn't want to have like a centralized definition of all their host names because their teams are decentralized, right? And so we went through a very big effort to kind of fundamentally change all the core data structures to allow this multi-host name model with these precedence rules for how you select a host name, such that for any given proxy, there's one host name, or there's one definition of a host name, but that same definition doesn't have to be the same for all the proxies based on the scoping rules. So I think it is, like if we ignore ambient, I would say it is valid to have different definitions of the same host name. It's not valid to have multiple of them attempt to be in play at once for a given proxy. In that if you don't define appropriately enough which one should be used, then we fall back to a random one. I don't know if it's literally random or a stable random, but effectively random undefined, right? But the problem is we have no scoping at all in ztunnel, so it's kind of moot. If you have any two definitions of the same host name in ambient, you're in a bad state. Just full stop. There's no mitigations.
But that feels like the problem statement to me.
No, I 100% agree. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Like this isn't the problem. Is not if we have creation timestamp. It's that we don't have export.
And the reason for not supporting export is the complexity of having sort of a different, each proxy has a different view, which would negate a lot of the over-the-wire cost savings and complexity of WDS. Is that correct?
I don't think there is a performance or complexity. Well, complexity is always tricky. There's not a code complexity challenge with export to, personally, because what I would do if I was to implement it would say, on each service, we had a field export to. Unfortunately, it's a list that can be namespaces. It's not just same or all or none or like it used to be. But still, a list is not so bad. In most cases, the list has one item, which is just the same namespace, right? We don't need a different view for each proxy. We can send all the services to all the ztunnels, right? Which would be quite hard to do otherwise because each ztunnel can serve like many different clients in many different namespaces. So what we're talking about is adding a couple bytes per service. Then on the filtering side, we just need a smarter lookup in terms of which one. Like I would imagine we would store a map. I think we actually already do store a map of like host name to a list of services. And so we could still do that and then just do a linear traversal of them to find the best match. Like people are not going to have 1,000 definitions of google.com such that the linear lookup is going to be a bottleneck, right? I think that would be very low complexity and very low performance overhead.
All right. So
the reason why I haven't done this is mostly because Louis has been adamantly against it, and I haven't had the energy to try and convince him otherwise. But I'm on board with export too, personally.
But with the export, this would lookup traversal would be done on the ztunnel, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So it would have a list of all the. I mean, it does already do this traversal. It just does it without export to information, right? It does it only based on the namespace, and then falling back to a random one.
So WDS would still be the same for every proxy.
It would, yeah. It would just have an extra field.
Mm-hmm. And then we still kind of run into the problem if we have two like export to stars, but at least that's something that can be mitigated. Well, right now you have no way around it.
I mean, right now we just assume everything is export star, right? So
Yeah.
like we do, yes,
Yeah.
we do have the issue that there's not deterministic for sure, but that's that's all you can do. So
Is this only for service entry? If we actually implement the export tool, we don't need for anything else. Is that
and
correct?
export 2 works on service as well. It's just an annotation instead of a native field. But it's only on service entry and service. We don't need it on anything else.
Okay.
There's no. I think Istio. I feel like Istio supports something else, but I don't think it's on something that. That Istio cares about. It's like destination role and virtual service and things like that.
Right. That's okay. Which we don't necessarily support.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just checked. Yeah. Service, virtual service, and destination role. So we only need to care about service, which is service and service entry. Yeah.
So export tool on services, I assume you by default it's that. But if I'm not exporting the services to you, like if I'm restrict my services only to this current namespace, then other people can't call that service without me even needing to write the OSI policy or network policy. Is that the idea? Just mimic the
No. No. Sorry. So export 2 by default is star for everything, service and service entry. It's not related at all to policy. It's a client side thing of whether the client knows about it. So this is why, by the way, I know Louis not here, so I'll argue on his behalf. This is, I think, one of the big reasons why Louis does not like export 2 and ambient. Is because people always mistake it as like or attempt to use it as a security policy. And like Stephen just said in chat, discoverability is not necessarily really security. Like in sidecars, people do this all the time. And, there's been whiz blog posts about people that have done it and got their clusters hijacked, and then KubeCon talks about it and all sorts of stuff. But my personal view is that, yes, you can misuse it, but you can also use it appropriately. And we're kind of hurting the people that are using Istio correctly just because people will misuse it. And the interesting thing is the way they're misusing it is like even the people that know that they're misusing it, they want to continue doing it. And they're annoyed, in my experience, that like it's actually one of the biggest blockers of ambient adoption is that they can't continue to misuse this feature.
Right. So by the way, do we support export 2 on service? I assume we don't support anything right now, right?
Right. Yeah. Nothing. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Service and service entry export 2 it's essentially they might as well treat them as the same thing. There's no difference really.
It won't be different in WDS either because it's the same data structure as well.
Yeah. In practice, for a cube service, if you don't export it, what? Forward to core DNS, let it resolve it, and send it anyway? Like, how do we? Like, how?
It wouldn't match. Are you saying what would happen if you've purposely sort of not export because the default star? So you're saying, are you asking Ian what happens if you do export to a namespace that your client is not in? What's the question?
Yeah, on a cube service, if I export to dot and then someone from a different namespace calls it, like,
Yeah,
okay,
it gets forwarded.
don't call that in the proxy anymore. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just saying, yeah, it gets resolved in kubedns, and then based on the traffic policy, it'll either allow or deny if it's unknown. We don't support registry only, so there's only one option, which is allow, which would then pass through. That sometimes is a foot gun for users because they like don't export something. Oh, see what I see happen a lot with sidecars is that people don't understand that the things that are in the mesh don't need to be known to the mesh so that they can call them appropriately. And so they try and do something like, okay, I have like half my services in the mesh, the other half I'm not going to export, so I don't need to know about them. And then they're like, oh, why is my rate limiting not working when I'm calling these things out of the mesh? It's like, well, you said to bypass it, and now it's going down to kube proxy instead of going through Istio, right? Typically, when people are doing this exporting stuff, they are also using registry only, in my experience, but we don't support that on ambient either. So, Keith, you're first.
Yeah, I think that just radicalized me to Louis' side, because the idea of export to without registry only, thinking about what that means practically, that feels very confusing and unexpected. Like, my experience is that users, especially with ambient, want to think about their mesh sort of being a part of the Kubernetes cluster. And so if you say export dot, where you're only exporting a service or a service entry to a namespace, but mesh clients can still talk to it fine, that feels like a broken expectation. Like, why would you do, essentially, why are you doing that? You're sort of allowing communication to happen through Kubernetes, but not through the mesh. And sort of they're relying on the mesh to be their single pane of glass. That's what we have in a lot of different places. And so I feel like if we're going to if we support export to, we would sort of by extension have to support registry only in order to have a cohesive experience.
I think he's basically said what I was going to confirm and ask, which, by the way, the result was shocking the way you explained to me, to everybody here, John. I was surprised you can still call that service, which is only export to the current namespace through the long mesh path. I think the behavior is very hard to resonate with people. So I guess I'm no longer very excited about supporting export to. I try to think, can we have a simplified version? Just, tell people this is how we're going to resolve your service for you, for your service entry for you, and have a deterministic way based on a pre-described way with supporting export to and also potential support registry, which I feel like it's like a lot of capability add for this feature. Ian, I think you have your hand next.
Yeah, not to dogpile on hating export to, but if we want to go that route, we probably need to figure out, like, you're going to get a VIP from core DNS that we would match and potentially like route to a waypoint. And then, like, do we need to work that out and say, like, oh, this actually shouldn't go to the waypoint because it's not exported or whatever. Anyways, that's a topic for if we go down the other path, I guess.
I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we could still, when we resolve the core DNS IP, part of export to is that we would not match, because we know the namespace, like the proxy in Zeton knows what namespace it's in. So we could easily like not match it. But the problem is we just pass through the connection anyway, because the discoverability policy or whatever it's called, the app on traffic policy, is to allow, even if we don't know what service it is.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we could handle it, but like, should we? Should we just bypass the waypoint in that case, or what? Anyways,
But we wouldn't know about the waypoint would be my point, because we don't know what service it is, so we just send to the service VIP, if I understand correctly.
well, like when we're resolving it, the client's going to dial a VIP, and we're going to say, hey, what is this VIP? And we're going to say, oh, that's this service that uses a waypoint, right?
But not if we have export to.
It's separate from the DNS resolving part.
Are we talking service or service entry?
For service entry, it's way more straightforward, because you're going to get like the real address of Google and we won't know what that is. But for service itself, like a cube service, you're going to get the same VIP that we could match. So
Yeah, I think what I'm saying is that if we did export to for service, the proper behavior I would think is to not match. If the proxy in the dtunnel proxy namespace does not if the service is not exported to the proxy's namespace.
yeah. So then we just need to add that hypothetically in the data path as well as in the DNS proxy.
That one's also easier because there is a one-to-one mapping between VIP and service. And so we would just look up the service and then just check if the export is allowed and ignore it if it's not allowed.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't trying to suggest it wasn't a tractable problem, just that we should make a decision about it if we go that route.
So, John, you
Right.
mentioned your. Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask. We don't have user complaining not able to support export to for service, right? The complaining is only about service entry. Is that accurate?
I would say that's probably accurate. Yeah, maybe. I'd say it's likely.
Okay, thanks.
But I wouldn't, I agree with what you're saying. I wouldn't be hesitant to support one without the other, though.
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking about, I have to think, if I'm thinking in the user's shoe, I feel like if we add support to export to service and the service entry, I have to think a lot more as to when to use it. Do I need them to be consistent? Like if my service is also providing, it's like the endpoint for service entry, do I need these to be consistent? There's a lot more things to think about. So that's what I was trying to think through too. It's like the complexity added, not just for service entry, but potentially for service as well.
For what it's worth, I don't think most users even know that export to exists for service. I think the difference here is sort of is the core motivating use cases. Like service, the way that service entry works, and I understand why it does this. The way service entry works matches typically Kubernetes semantics. You create a service in one namespace, but it's still reachable to all namespaces from a core TCP perspective without you having to manually export or import across namespaces. That's part of the core design of service and the core experiences that users expect. With service entry, however, now you're talking about external singletons, and you're wanting to change the behavior per client based on who the sort of the admin namespace persona or the admin of the namespace persona. That's a little bit different. So users are looking for export to sort of apply different organizational patterns on the way that they consume external services. So really, I think I don't see it as being too much more for users for us to support both. It's just sort of depending on what sort of model they want to implement across.
Let me ask you this: if we do support export to as a client, do I also need to do import from? Or does the import automatically implies because I have I have the visibility, discoverability because of the export to?
I don't know that it's decided, but as discussed at the moment, there would be no import concept still, and so you would get everything that's exported to you, I think.
You could potentially still resolve to two. Is that correct? Let's say if I have a namespace, you have a namespace, both of us are exporting out foo.com, right? So you could still ends up the problem you initially have, even with export to?
Yeah, 100%.
Okay.
I think it reduces the scope of that by a lot.
Yes,
Probably.
it does reduce. Yeah.
And you could maybe have your own validation rules that prevent customers from exporting to anything other than dot or something like that, and then really sort of clamp down on this and fix it. But there would be no complete fix, just like out of the box if you are doing Wild West service entries.
Right. Either we have some import or we still tell people, hey, this is how we're going to resolve them when there's conflict.
And then just to be clear, I didn't mean to imply that import export is something that we really need to do. There are other things we could consider. I wrote one here that I had thought of, which is to basically just say, never do the first thing. If it's not in your namespace and it's not a kube service and it's not in the preferred namespace, then don't resolve it. Is like another potential solution that makes the behavior deterministic. And maybe that's not what you want, but it doesn't involve like any sort of scoping per se. And also time check. We burned through like 40 minutes on this topic. So if we want to defer it for like more discussion later and get to other things, that's okay by me. Keith, I think you have the next two. So maybe
as a rule, when we hit this much time on one topic, it's usually a good indicator that we need a doc.
That is very true. Yeah, I think if somebody wants to start a thread in Slack, that might be a good place to follow up. The only open question for me at this point is if we want to support, if we're even entertaining supporting registry only for ambient. But we can follow up on that. I think John actually has a second topic here on the recording uploads, unless I missed discussion on that at the beginning.
No, it's a second one. It's probably a quick one, but someone mentioned hopefully that we haven't posted a recording on YouTube in 3 months, which I suspect means that there was one person doing it that stopped doing it, and we need to restart it. I don't know who that is or who knows. Yeah, Daniel?
It was Craig that was doing it before.
That's kind of what I suspected.
Actually, I set up a Zapier automation for it, so it should have been completely automatic. I'll double check that and see what's going on there.
Craig was paying the bill. No, I don't know. Okay, thanks, Keith.
No
Yeah, so I
problem.
talked to him not long before he left, and he told me he was managing Zapier for it, but that was the last I heard.
I've got the cred. The creds are in the TOC steering 1Password, so everybody with access to that should have access to it. And I still see it here. I'll just have to make sure that I'll double check to see that the Google Drive is folder that we've got access to is the right one. But thanks for flagging it. I'll take a look. I guess I'm the next topic too. So yeah, this one was sort of a general question about the future of things, specifically Istio layout. So right now, especially with ambient multi-cluster and ambient index generally, we've got two different service registries in Istio. We've in a lot of ways. You've got the one that was around for like 6 years before we did ambient, and then we've got the ambient index. One uses KRT and sort of exposes KRT collections for a lot of its data. The other has sort of a, for multi-cluster specifically, sort of has this callback constructor mechanism for executing different things when a new cluster is added or removed. These 2 points are sort of my second topic sort of related to this, but I'm wanting to start some early discussion to see, do people here have strong feelings on the future of the Istio service registry? To see, obviously it's going to be extremely complex, but I imagine for things coming down the line, like inference pool imports, there's talk about potentially a new like composite backend thing to help facilitate multi-cluster, like the MCS like multi-cluster patterns more generally. So as we sort of move forward with the Kubernetes model of how to think about multiple clusters and different services across multiple clusters, different policies in multiple clusters, wanted to see sort of what the current appetite is for refactoring the registry to sort of make all of this COD sort of KRT native, or at least the service registry part more KRT native.
In general, I am in favor. I think KRT, the more you use it, the better it is. It's obviously a lot of work and high risk work. That's the main downside, I think. I think when we first introduced KRT, we had kind of said, we'll do it in more experimental stuff and then see how it goes and expand it more broadly. I think we've proven that it's cleared for broader use in terms of, is it maintainable, does it scale, etc. We moved the Gateway API over, performance was much better. We've had no real issues with performance in the ambient side. So yeah, overall, like, I'm in favor. It's just a lot of work that's a problem, and it's something that it's tricky to do incrementally. I'm not sure if you followed this much, but there was a decent amount of work. There's really, in my mind, Istio is like two parts: the discovery. There's the service discovery, and then like the config discovery. We actually have been moving over more of the config discovery. It's actually much closer to being all KRT than the service discovery side is. Like, we moved over the gateway one, we moved over the ingress one. The only one left, I think, maybe there's probably some other small one, but is the just reading the CRDs directly from Kubernetes, which is the easiest one to move over to KRT. So I'm not saying necessarily, I don't know, I just bring that up. I don't know if it necessarily means anything. It doesn't mean we should go faster or slower on the service discovery side. But the service discovery one's more tightly coupled because the two registries, the service entry and the Kubernetes one, kind of cross talk to each other, which is actually much better in KRT, funnily enough. But also just makes it complicated because you can't really move one over without the other without awkwardness. I do have a peer OC from the service entry registry before it was called KRT, so it's like all the functions are probably different and whatnot, but it might be loosely helpful that I can dig up probably if we want to look at that. That's a lot of things, but actually one important thing is, so unifying KRT, yes, I think that makes sense, but the ambient service discovery model is a totally different type than the rest of the service discovery model. So it's one thing to say like the implementation detail of the controller. Well, I guess stepping one step back, sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but we need to find like where is the boundary of KRT, right? So today we have these controllers and they're kind of these black boxes that implement some interface. I think the interface is called like service discovery, right? And then that gets fed into like the push context and the endpoint index. If we, like hypothetically, you have every single thing in the entire control plane in KRT down to the XDS, right? And you have like a Envoy XDS route KRT collection that it gets compiled down all the way from the tip top. This is actually how K-Gateway works. There's some issues with how they implement it there, but I know what those issues are, so I can make sure we avoid them. But I think doing that is like way too much to bite off in one chunk. I think what we'd want is to keep the same interfaces and have the KRT be exposed behind those. This is actually kind of how ambient works today. We don't do KRT all the way through to the XDS.
Right. We have
We
shims
expose
in
it.
different places that sort of feed
Exactly.
back. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's easy to shim it too because you just, once you get to the end of KRT, you just slap a register, handler on it that feeds into the other stuff and calls their event handlers. So I would think we expose it behind that interface. Now, that does mean if we're not changing anything, that we then have still two service discovery implementations though, because we have the ambient one and then we have the model.service one. So I have absolutely no problem doing that change. I think that's just, it's hard work. It's not easy. It's high risk. So like there's there's technical challenges, but I have no issue from the design side. But when we want to cross that threshold or unifying the service type or going beyond those interfaces, then I think we'll need to think through it more. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it necessarily, but in my mind, there's not a clear path from here to there that is obvious and makes sense. So.
Yeah, thanks, John. That's super helpful, and that matches pretty much my understanding. I'll add some of the more of the motivation here. For me, again, I'm looking at a lot of the multi-cluster stuff and the AI multi-cluster things coming out of Kubernetes, et cetera, and like the way this came about. I'm looking at the multi-cluster work we did for the ambient index for multi-cluster ambient, and I was like, oh, it would be super useful to have this KRT collection that we've built of remote clusters at some higher level versus the ambient index, to where we can have a separate controller that's now multi-cluster aware by just reading the remote clusters KRT collection versus the current step where you've got to register as a multi-cluster constructor, all that sort of stuff. So I think even like what you laid out makes a lot of sense, because as we move some of the core service discovery things over and shim it into like the XDS push context, those sorts of things, doing that incrementally sort of allows us to move maybe some of the stuff in the ambient index, even just the multi-cluster stuff, even move some of that stuff to a more centralized place and stop duplicating, which I think will be useful. We'll have to run them side by side, I think, because it is super high risk, and we want to try to make sure it's stable for multiple releases before we limit it to just one implementation. But I think the long-term sort of result there would be a lot of those the core information that Istio knows about being accessible to various controllers via collections.
Yeah, I have some more thoughts, but I'll let anyone else talk if anyone has opinions. Okay. The one thing as well, Keith, by the way, in another project, I set up a KRT XDS server, so that like, you know how we have generators for each type today.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Instead, you just pass it KRT collections, and it just automatically exposes all of those. Like each KRT collection is one XDS resource, so it has to be a type that can be converted into a proto. So that's honestly like the easiest part of the problem if we go beyond the interface layer, because the real chunk is like, how do we get rid of push context and all the intermediates?
Right.
But just throwing out, if we get down that route, I've done a little bit there that we could potentially reuse. On the other side, the big question I would have is, like the multi-cluster stuff is so tricky, because right now how it's modeled is like you have a controller that's single cluster, and then the multi-cluster stuff aggregates it.
Right.
But with this, it's kind of different, because you have the controller is the multi-cluster thing, right? Sort of. Like, we'll just need to figure out where the multi-cluster lives, really. Some diagrams here mapping out like what we want to do would go a long way, I think.
Oh yeah, completely agree. This would need to be a very detailed design doc, because there's just so much that can go wrong and so much that's moving. I think I have an idea of how things can work, but you're really good at telling me when I'm wrong, so I'll get some of these thoughts on paper and let you tear them apart so I can put them back together.
Yeah, the thing that would be the easiest thing that you could do right now, and I don't know that we want to take incremental stuff like this without knowing the end goal, but would be like, you could swap out the whole service entry controller with KRT, I think.
Service entry as in like the CRD, or like the Istio
the service entry service discovery controller that implements that interface.
Okay.
You could probably also do the Kubernetes one. It's just harder because it's bigger, because it reads like 5 types instead of 2.
Right.
Now, is it worth doing that? I think like you probably want to do both together, just so that then, because otherwise you have to do, so there's like handlers between the two. And so if only one of them's KRT, then you're gonna have to do one of those like I forget what it's called, like the dependency trigger thing where that like breaks the KRT, which would kind of suck. Actually, no, you could probably do like a static collection, but anyhow, it would be much better if you didn't have to do any of that, right? And they were just both KRT. So I think when I did the service entry implementation initially, I just didn't implement the handlers, the crosstalk between the two, because I didn't merge and it was just a prototype. So I think that's how I avoided it then. But obviously, for the real thing, we can't do that. So.
Okay, yeah, this will be. I think this is a good. Well, at least in this short conversation, it sounds like there's. I won't say consensus because it's just sort of the two of us talking, but it sounds like there is some light interest in pursuing this, and I on my part, I do think it's going to unlock just simpler contributions over the long term. Not just because KRT is simpler, but because you're not having to think about 2 different models for how to get data from one part of the control plane to another. I think it's going to be super useful. All right, That's helpful. Thank you. Anybody else have any thoughts?
Yeah. So I don't disagree with the direction that you guys are setting. That seems good. Like I generally prefer KRT. I think a takeaway might be like trying to chunk up what are the different stages that we could do and like record them. So yeah, I don't know if we want to like assign someone to that or just kind of work on it as a community or whatever, but I think that would be like a great next step.
Yeah, I'll put a doc together of sort of summarizing some of this, sort of jot down my understanding of how we could go about doing this, and then we can review async and figure out, who wants to take what, or if there's missing steps, or figure out what sort of that risk tolerance threshold where we want to, how long we want to wait between each stage. I think is going to be critical for making sure that we don't disrupt existing users as well. One of the interesting things about this is with KRT is that so much of it is an ambient world. We're going to have to figure out how to marry sidecar semantics with ambient semantics to the extent that they differ within the same framework, which shouldn't be horrible, but something to keep in mind as we're designing. So I'll take the action item of putting together that doc, and then we can discuss once I've got that ready.
All right, should we wrap this up? We only have 3 minutes. I think it's hard to discuss any topic, but Keith, I like your summary on that topic. Special concern for me would be not breaking away existing user. So having a doc to outline, what are the goals would be great. All right, I saw some nods. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Thanks all.